Everyone thought he'd be punished, but no one expected this. The courtroom was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as if every breath had been swallowed by the walls themselves. Sunlight streamed weakly through the tall, narrow windows, casting long, muted shadows across the worn wooden benches. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, mixed with the faint odor of coffee that lingered from a morning rush. It was a typical day at the municipal courthouse, yet for one man, it was far from ordinary. An elderly man shuffled forward, his steps slow and deliberate. His back was slightly bent, the result of years of labor and wear, yet he carried himself with a quiet dignity that was hard to ignore. In his hands, he clutched a small slip of paper, unassuming to anyone else, but to him, it represented a mountain too heavy to climb. It was a parking ticket, a minor legal infraction on paper, yet in reality, it was a burden that had grown far beyond its ink and numbers. Every fine, every additional charge, every late fee had accumulated until the total felt insurmountable. His hands trembled slightly, not from age alone, but from the weight of worry that had followed him for weeks. How would he manage this? Where would he find the money? Would he have to skip meals or borrow from neighbors he barely knew? Or, worst of all, risk losing the little dignity he had left by pleading for mercy in a courtroom filled with strangers? He had lived a life of routine, modest work, and careful planning, but life, unpredictable as it often is, had thrown him into a storm that even his careful steps could not navigate. The courtroom itself seemed to amplify his anxiety. The polished wooden benches reflected the dim light, each scratch and imperfection whispering tales of thousands who had come before him, people just like him, facing small and large trials alike. The walls, lined with portraits of stern-faced judges and plaques detailing decades of legal history, seemed to watch him. Every eye, whether real or imagined, weighed on him, reminding him of the rules and the authority that governed this small, silent kingdom of law. He approached the center of the room, the sound of his shoes faint against the hardwood floors, each step echoing like a metronome counting down to a moment he had feared for days. The ticket in his hand felt heavier with each step, a tangible symbol of a life made fragile by circumstances beyond his control. He could feel the tension in the room. It was palpable. Other defendants, waiting for their own hearings, shifted nervously. A young clerk shuffled papers, trying not to draw attention, yet every rustle sounded amplified in the heavy air. Even the judge's robe, hanging neatly as he prepared for the proceedings, seemed to command respect before a word had been spoken. He glanced briefly at the judge, catching sight of a calm, composed figure whose eyes carried a weight of authority and experience. The judge's gaze, though not directly on him yet, seemed to assess everything: the room, the people, the energy that hung like fog. The man swallowed hard. He had faced challenges before, yes, but none quite like this. He had faced illness, financial struggles, and loneliness, but this combination of legal consequence and personal helplessness was unique. It was a moment that felt both intimate and public, small in scale, yet immense in emotional weight. As he stepped closer to the front, he noticed subtle details that somehow amplified the moment. The faint ticking of a clock on the wall marking time with relentless precision, the slight draft from a half-open window that made the papers on the clerk's desk flutter, the hushed whispers of spectators who had quietly gathered, drawn by curiosity and routine. Each detail heightened his awareness of himself, magnifying the anxiety he carried. Every small noise, every shadow, every movement seemed amplified in the quiet, forming a backdrop for a trial he had never wanted but could not avoid. His mind raced, trying to anticipate what would come next. Would the fine be negotiable? Would he be lectured, scolded, or simply dismissed? He could feel the pressure building in his chest, a tightness that made breathing slightly more difficult. Memories flashed, times when he had saved carefully, times when he had helped others, times when life had tested him and he had endured. Now, standing in front of a judge in a room filled with history and authority, those memories felt distant and fragile, like echoes of a life that might not be enough to protect him here. He clutched the ticket more firmly, trying to anchor himself. His fingers, though aged and slightly stiff, tightened instinctively around the paper, as if sheer will could somehow make the burden lighter. He could feel the weight of expectations, unspoken yet real, pressing from every angle. The courtroom silence seemed to settle over him like a fog, thick and impenetrable. He wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize, to make everything right, yet the words stuck in his throat. He was conscious of every eye in the room, every subtle movement, every potential judgment. The room waited, as if holding its collective breath. Every heartbeat, every shuffle of feet, every quiet murmur from the gallery was magnified in his mind. Time seemed to slow, stretching each second into something longer, heavier, almost tangible. It was more than just a fine. It was a test of patience, of humanity, of grace. The small slip of paper in his hand, the parking ticket that seemed so trivial to the outside world, had become the measure of his courage, his dignity, and the delicate balance between law and mercy. And in that moment, as he stood silently, uncertain of what would come next, he realized how small gestures, tiny decisions, and the quiet power of discretion could shape lives. The room, the judge, the walls, the air itself, they all became actors in a story far larger than any simple legal matter. And though he did not know what the outcome would be, he knew that this moment, the waiting, the tension, the fear, and the hope, was one he would carry forever, etched in memory, a vivid testament to the fragile, complicated, and deeply human experience of standing before justice. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to pause in the courtroom. The elderly man, still standing with his ticket clutched tightly in his hands, felt the weight of the room settle like a physical presence upon him. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears, a rapid rhythm that carried the anxiety, hope, and desperation he had held onto for so many weeks. Every face in the room, from the spectators seated quietly in the back to the young clerks arranging papers, seemed to be holding its breath, awaiting the moment that would decide the course of one man's day, and perhaps the rest of his week or month or even more. Judge Frank Caprio, seated calmly behind the bench, had been observing this tension with a measured gaze. Years of experience had taught him the weight that even a small legal proceeding could carry in the lives of ordinary people. He had seen countless defendants, each with their own story, fears, and burdens, and he had learned that law was more than a set of rigid rules. It was a framework meant to serve the people, not crush them. His hands rested lightly on the bench in front of him, and he looked up, meeting the elderly man's eyes with a calm, steady presence that immediately conveyed both authority and empathy. Then, in that quiet, almost sacred moment, he spoke. His voice was calm, neither loud nor commanding, yet carried across the room with clarity and purpose. The law allows discretion, and today I choose compassion. The words hung in the air, simple yet profound, carrying the weight of decades of judicial experience and the gentle insistence of human kindness. The courtroom, until that moment tense and charged, seemed to exhale, as if everyone present understood that something rare and important had just occurred. The elderly man's eyes widened slightly, disbelief and relief mingling in equal measure. For years, he had known rules, regulations, and fines. He had feared the impersonal machinery of law, convinced that mercy was something found only in stories. But now, before him, in the flesh and presence of someone entrusted with judgment, mercy was real. It was not abstract, not theoretical, not a platitude. It was here, articulated in words, confirmed by intention, and ready to manifest in action. The clerk's hand, poised over the paperwork, stopped mid-motion. The room's murmurs and shifting feet faded into silence, as if the very walls themselves were listening. Spectators who had come to witness a routine proceeding found themselves caught up in something larger, a tangible example of justice infused with humanity. Some leaned forward slightly, their eyes softening, their attention no longer on the procedural mechanics of a fine, but on the essence of what it meant to exercise authority with conscience. And then the decision was confirmed. The fine was waived. The slip of paper which had seemed impossibly heavy in the elderly man's hand was now inconsequential, rendered almost symbolic by the judge's choice. It was not that the rules themselves had been ignored or bent, the law had been respected. Yet within its framework, compassion had found space to operate. It was a delicate balance, a demonstration of the power of discretion exercised wisely, and a reminder to everyone present that rules are a guide, not an unyielding instrument meant to crush human spirit. For the man himself, relief washed over him in waves he hadn't expected. His shoulders relaxed, though only slightly, as though years of worry and anticipation had been partially lifted. He could feel the tension melting from his chest, replaced by a quiet gratitude that didn't need words. It was more than just monetary relief. It was the validation that his struggles were recognized, that someone had seen beyond the simple violation and acknowledged the complexity of his life. This was a form of justice that transcended legal codes. It honored dignity. The spectators in the courtroom, too, felt the subtle but profound shift. Some whispered softly to each other, astonished at the humanity displayed in a setting often associated with formality and rigidity. Others nodded slowly, internalizing a lesson that justice could be firm yet kind, authoritative yet empathetic. For a moment, the courtroom became a living illustration of the principle that law, when tempered with compassion, could protect without punishing, guide without condemning, and uphold both the letter and the spirit of justice. Judge Caprio remained composed, his calm demeanor a quiet reinforcement of a lesson being imparted. He did not raise his voice, he did not gesture dramatically, and he did not seek recognition or applause. His authority, softened by empathy, was all the more powerful because it required no theatrics. Every person present understood that what had just occurred was genuine, earned, and rooted in the simplest yet most profound human truth, that rules serve humanity, and not the other way around. The elderly man's hands, once tense and rigid, relaxed fully now. He looked up, briefly meeting the judge's eyes, and offered a small nod, a gesture of respect, gratitude, and recognition. Words were unnecessary. The connection had already been made through understanding, through the act of mercy itself. Around him, the room remained still, as if collectively honoring the quiet power of compassion, the rare but meaningful instance where law and humanity intersect seamlessly. Even after the man turned to leave, the silence lingered. It was a silence filled not with emptiness, but with reflection, with acknowledgement of the simple, universal lesson witnessed, that justice without empathy is incomplete, but justice with understanding transforms lives. The courtroom, for all its formal structure, had become a space where humanity mattered more than mere procedure. Every observer left with a reminder that the world, though often rigid and unforgiving, has room for kindness, discretion, and compassion, if someone chooses to exercise it. In the days that followed, stories of that brief moment circulated quietly among those who had been present. It became less about a fine waived and more about the principle it embodied, that laws are meant to guide, not punish unnecessarily, and that within every system, small acts of empathy can ripple outward, influencing how people view justice, fairness, and human dignity. And though it was a single, small moment in a single courtroom, its significance lingered far beyond the walls of that room, reminding everyone that sometimes the greatest lessons are taught not through force, but through quiet, deliberate compassion.